On July 31st, 1946, a Hungarian woman named Ilona walked into a Budapest bakery with 400 octillion pengő. That's a 4 followed by 29 zeros. She bought one loaf of bread. 3 years earlier, that same amount of money could have purchased every building in the city, every factory, every farm in the entire country. And now it bought flour, water and yeast pressed into a single loaf. But here's the detail that historians rarely mention. Ilona's neighbor, a man named Ferenc, walked into that same bakery on that same day with something different in his pocket. A single gold coin, an old Habsburg ducat his grandfather had hidden in 1910. He bought 40 loaves, enough to feed his family for a month. Same economy, same collapse, same day. Two completely different outcomes. This pattern, the same pattern, has repeated in every monetary collapse for the last 500 years. Some assets become worthless, others survive, and a small number actually increase in value, while everything else burns. The question you should be asking yourself right now isn't whether this could happen again, it's whether you're holding the bread money or the gold coin. There is a photograph taken in Berlin in November 1923 that tells you everything you need to know about the mathematics of collapse. In it, a German housewife is feeding banknotes into a furnace, not because she's wealthy, because the paper currency was worth less than the firewood it could replace. The numbers printed on those notes, thousands, millions, billions of marks, had become meaningless. The ink cost more than the value it represented. 8 months earlier, those same notes had bought groceries, paid rent, kept families clothed and fed. Now they were fuel. This is the moment that separates those who understood what was happening from those who didn't. And it happened faster than anyone expected. In 1998, a retired Russian school teacher named Valentina watched her entire life savings, accumulated over 40 years of work, become worth less than a single American dollar bill. The ruble didn't decline slowly. It collapsed in 17 days. Her pension, her savings account, her government bonds, all of it became vapor. But her colleague, another teacher named Dmitry, had converted half his savings into physical dollars 6 months earlier. Not because he was a financial genius, but because his brother-in-law, who worked at a bank, had whispered a warning at a family dinner. Dmitry kept his apartment. Valentina lost hers. In Buenos Aires in December 2001, the Argentine government froze all bank accounts overnight. They called it the corralito, the little corral. Families who had saved responsibly, who had trusted the banking system, who had done everything right, woke up to find their money imprisoned behind locked doors. The banks didn't open for months. When they did, the peso had lost 75% of its value. But there were families, a minority, always a minority, who had seen the signs. They had quietly moved assets, diversified holdings, converted paper into things that couldn't be frozen or devalued by government decree. These 3 moments, Berlin, Moscow, Buenos Aires, span 8 decades and 3 continents. Different languages, different political systems, different cultures. Yet the pattern is identical. In every case, certain assets went to zero. Government promises evaporated. Currencies became worthless. Bonds became decorative paper. Bank accounts became inaccessible fiction. And in every case, certain other assets survived. Some even thrived. This is not a story about pessimism. This is not a prediction of doom. This is a documentary about mathematics, about the documented, repeatable, historically verified pattern of what happens when debt becomes unsustainable and currencies fail. Because here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. Monetary collapses don't destroy wealth equally. They transfer it, massively, rapidly, from those holding the wrong assets to those holding the right ones. The question isn't whether you believe a collapse could happen. The question is whether you understand what separates survivors from casualties when it does. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to examine the exposed nerve of financial history. We'll document exactly which assets went to zero in every major collapse of the modern era, and which assets emerged intact on the other side. We'll examine gold, land, essential businesses, foreign hard currency, physical commodities. We'll look at what worked, What failed and why? And we'll map the 7 warning stages that precede every collapse, so you can see for yourself where we stand today. Because the survivors of 1923 Berlin, 1998 Moscow, and 2001 Buenos Aires all had one thing in common. They saw the pattern before it was too late. The question is, will you? In a vault beneath the streets of Paris, there is a collection that no museum wants to display. Stacked in acid-free folders, preserved under climate control, lies over 2 billion francs worth of Russian imperial bonds. They are beautiful documents. Ornate borders, imperial eagles, promises of 6% annual interest guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the Romanov dynasty. They are worth nothing. In 1917, French citizens held more Russian government debt than any other foreign population. Doctors, teachers, shopkeepers, retirees, they had trusted the bonds of a great empire. Russia was modernizing. Railroads were being built. The interest payments arrived like clockwork year after year. Then came the revolution. The Bolsheviks repudiated all Tsarist debt in February 1918. They declared that the workers' government owed nothing to foreign capitalists. Overnight, 2 billion francs became decorative paper. An estimated 1.6 million French families lost their savings, not to a market decline, not to a bad investment, but to the complete and total evaporation of sovereign debt. This is what going to zero actually means. It happened to Confederate bondholders in 1865. The southern states had issued approximately $2.1 billion in debt to finance the Civil War. Wealthy families, banks, even foreign investors had purchased these bonds trusting in the Confederacy's promise to repay. When the South surrendered at Appomattox, those bonds became worthless by constitutional amendment. The 14th Amendment explicitly forbade the United States, or any state, from ever paying Confederate debts. $2 billion. Gone, not declined, not devalued, erased. The Weimar Republic's bonds suffered a different but equally total death. German war bonds, sold to patriotic citizens between 1914 and 1918, promised repayment in marks. The government kept that promise. Technically, they repaid the bonds in full. But by November 1923, the marks they used for repayment couldn't buy a newspaper. A bond worth 10,000 marks in 1918 was repaid with currency that couldn't purchase a single egg. This is the first category of assets that goes to zero. Government debt instruments, bonds, treasury notes, sovereign promises. The pattern is remarkably consistent across centuries. But currencies themselves are even more vulnerable. The Roman denarius was once the most trusted currency in the Western world. In 64 AD, under Nero, the coin contained 94% pure silver. By 268 AD, just 2 centuries later, the same coin contained less than 5% silver. The rest was bronze and copper, washed with a thin silver coating to maintain appearances. Roman citizens didn't experience this as a sudden collapse. They experienced it as a slow, grinding theft. Prices rose, savings purchased less. The money in their purses looked the same, but bought less each year. By the time the debasement became obvious, the damage was irreversible. The American Continental Dollar followed an even faster trajectory. Issued in 1775 to finance the Revolutionary War, the Continental was backed by nothing but congressional promise. By 1779, just 4 years later, it took 42 Continental dollars to purchase $1 in gold coin. The phrase "not worth a Continental" entered the American vocabulary as a synonym for worthlessness. The French assignats, issued during the Revolution in 1789, were supposedly backed by seized church lands. The government promised restraint, they printed anyway. By 1795, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. The currency was officially abandoned in 1796, replaced by a new currency, which also collapsed. And in our lifetime, the Zimbabwean dollar achieved something mathematically remarkable. In November 2008, Zimbabwe's monthly inflation rate reached 79.6 billion%. Prices doubled every 24.7 hours. The government printed $100 trillion notes. They became collector's items worth more as curiosities than as money. Here is the pattern. Here is the warning. There are 5 triggers that precede every currency death. First, war financing through unlimited debt. Every example above began with a government spending beyond its means to fund conflict or crisis. Second, loss of productive economic capacity. Factories close, trade collapses. The economy produces less while the money supply expands. Third, political instability. Revolutions, coups, regime changes. Governments that won't exist tomorrow have no reason to honor yesterday's promises. Fourth, trade collapse. When imports dry up and exports become worthless, currencies lose their external anchor. Fifth, the confidence spiral. Once citizens begin converting currency to hard assets, the rush accelerates. Each conversion weakens the currency further, triggering more conversions. These 5 triggers have preceded every currency collapse in recorded history. The assets that go to zero first are always the same: government bonds, paper currency, and any financial instrument backed solely by sovereign promise. But if paper burns, what survives the fire? In 1991, as the Soviet Union entered its death spiral, an elderly man named Victor stood in a Moscow bread line for 6 hours. He had worked 40 years as an engineer. He had saved diligently. He had trusted the system. The rubles in his pocket, his entire monthly pension, could no longer buy cooking oil. 3 blocks away, in a cramped apartment, Victor's childhood friend Alexander unlocked a small metal box hidden beneath his floorboards. Inside were 14 gold coins, Tsarist-era 5-ruble pieces his grandmother had buried in 1916 and passed down through 3 generations of whispered secrecy. Alexander sold 1 coin that week. He bought enough food for 3 months. The Soviet ruble lost 99% of its value between 1990 and 1992. Alexander's gold coins, minted under a government that had been dead for 74 years, purchased more in 1992 than they had in 1916. This is not an anomaly. This is the pattern. When Rome's denarius became worthless bronze, Roman gold coins, the aureus and later the solidus, remained functional currency. Merchants who refused debased silver would still accept gold. Landowners who laughed at paper promises would trade for gold weight. The metal transcended the empire that minted it. A Roman solidus from 400 AD contained approximately 4.5 grams of pure gold. Today, that same weight of gold purchases roughly what it purchased then. A quality set of clothing, a week's skilled labor, a modest amount of land. The emperors are dust. The currency endures. In Austria, 1922, the krone collapsed with devastating speed. Prices doubled every few weeks. Middle-class savings evaporated. But Austrian families who held gold coins, ducats, florins, even foreign sovereigns, found themselves suddenly wealthy relative to their neighbors. They could purchase apartments for the price of a month's rent. They could buy businesses for the cost of inventory. Gold didn't make them rich. The collapse of everything else did. But here is where the story becomes complicated. Here is where gold's limitations reveal themselves. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. It required all American citizens to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. The penalty for non-compliance: 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The government paid $20.67 per ounce, the official price. Once the gold was collected, Roosevelt revalued it to $35 per ounce. The government had effectively confiscated 41% of its citizens' gold wealth through legal decree. Most Americans complied. They had little choice. The gold was visible, traceable, stored in bank-safe deposit boxes that the government could access, but some didn't comply. The families who kept gold coins hidden, in walls, in gardens, in secret compartments, retained their wealth. The families who surrendered their gold received paper dollars that would lose 40% of their purchasing power over the next decade. This reveals gold's paradox. It survives collapse, but it attracts confiscation. It holds value, but it can be seized. It transcends governments, but governments know this, and they plan accordingly. Every major currency crisis in the 20th century was followed by some form of gold restriction, capital controls, export bans, mandatory conversion. Governments facing collapse do not allow competing currencies to flourish. So what does this mean for gold as a survival asset? The historical record is clear. Gold preserves wealth through currency collapse better than almost any alternative. Families who held gold through Weimar, through the Soviet collapse, through Argentina's peso crisis, they emerged on the other side with purchasing power intact. But gold requires discretion. It requires planning. It requires understanding that the same properties that make gold valuable in a crisis, its density of value, its universal recognition, its independence from government, also make it a target. The survivors understood this. They held gold quietly. They stored it carefully. They never spoke of it until the danger had passed. Gold is the first asset that survives collapse, but it is not the only one. The Junker families of Prussia had ruled their estates for centuries before the Weimar collapse began. They were not financial sophisticates. They were landowners, aristocrats whose wealth was measured in hectares, not bank balances. Their manor houses were old. Their farming methods were traditional. Their cash reserves were modest. Industrialists who had kept profits in mark-denominated accounts saw fortunes evaporate in weeks. The professional class, doctors, lawyers, professors, discovered that a lifetime of savings couldn't purchase a winter coat. But the Junkers still had their land. And land, unlike currency, cannot be printed. By late 1923, the Junker estates were worth more relative to the German economy than they had been in a century. Not because the land had changed, because everything measured in marks had collapsed around it. Families who had seemed merely comfortable before the crisis emerged as the new ultra-wealthy. Not through speculation, but through the simple act of holding something real. This pattern repeated in Argentina during the peso crisis of 2001-2002. The great estancias, cattle ranches stretching across the pampas, had been in the same families for generations. When the peso lost 75% of its value and bank accounts were frozen, these landowners experienced something remarkable. Their debts, denominated in pesos, effectively vanished. A mortgage that once represented 20 years of income could suddenly be paid off with a single cattle sale. The estancia owners emerged from the crisis owning their land free and clear, while their urban counterparts lost apartments, businesses, and savings. But the principle extends far beyond crisis periods. Consider the British aristocracy, a class that has survived the War of the Roses, the English Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars, the decline of empire, and the rise of socialism. Families like the Grosvenors, the Cadogans, the Howards. They have held their estates for 500 years or more. How? Not through financial genius, not through market timing, through the simple, stubborn retention of productive land. The Duke of Westminster's family acquired land in what is now Mayfair and Belgravia in 1677. It was then farmland and swamp outside London's walls. 3.5 centuries later, that land is worth approximately $9 billion. Wars came and went. Currencies rose and fell. Governments changed. The land remained. This is the mathematical reality of productive land. It generates value independent of currency. A farm produces food whether the currency is pounds, marks, or bottle caps. A rental property provides shelter regardless of what unit measures the rent. The productive capacity exists in physical reality, not in financial abstraction. But there is a crucial distinction. The historical record demands we acknowledge. Productive land survives. Speculative land does not. During the Irish famine of the 1840s, absentee landlords who owned productive estates, land that grew food, that employed tenants, that generated real economic output, retained their holdings through the catastrophe. Many even expanded, purchasing distressed properties from less fortunate owners. But landlords who had borrowed heavily to acquire land for speculation, betting on continued price appreciation rather than productive yield, faced foreclosure and ruin. The land itself survived. The debt attached to it did not. This distinction matters enormously. Land with productive capacity, farmland, rental property, resource-rich acreage, has survived every monetary collapse in recorded history. The Junkers understood this. The estancia owners understood this. The British aristocracy built their survival on this principle. The asset that survives is not merely land. It is productive land, held free of debt, generating value independent of whatever currency happens to measure it. Gold preserves wealth. Land generates it. Land. But there are three more assets the historical record reveals. Assets that are rarely discussed, frequently overlooked, and absolutely critical for those who wish to understand the complete picture. In the ruins of Weimar Germany, two industrial families didn't merely survive, they expanded. The Krupp dynasty had manufactured steel and armaments since 1811. The Thyssen family had built their fortune in coal and iron. When the mark collapsed, when savings evaporated, when the middle class disintegrated, these families acquired competitors for pennies on the dollar. Not because they were lucky, because they owned something that couldn't be printed, essential productive capacity. A steel mill produces steel whether the currency is stable or worthless. A coal mine extracts coal regardless of what numbers the government prints on paper. The physical machinery, the trained workers, the established supply chains, these exist in material reality. They generate value that must be measured in something. When that something is a collapsing currency, the business doesn't become worthless. The currency becomes irrelevant. The Krupps paid workers partially in company scrip and housing. They bartered steel for raw materials. They operated effectively as a private economy within the failing public one. By 1924, when the new Rentenmark stabilized Germany, Krupp had absorbed competitors, expanded production capacity, and emerged stronger than before the crisis began. This is asset number 3. Essential businesses with tangible productive capacity. Not every business survives collapse. Retailers dependent on consumer spending fail. Service companies watching customers disappear fail. Financial firms holding worthless paper fail spectacularly. But businesses that produce necessities, food, energy, materials, medicine, these businesses find customers regardless of economic conditions. People must eat. Factories must have power. Construction requires steel. The demand exists independent of currency stability. The Russian oligarchs of the 1990s understood this principle with predatory clarity. When the Soviet Union collapsed, state enterprises were privatized through a corrupt voucher system. Citizens receive vouchers representing shares in state assets. Most citizens, desperate for immediate cash, sold their vouchers for trivial sums. A small number of men, Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, Abramovich, and others, accumulated these vouchers systematically. They acquired oil fields, aluminum smelters, nickel mines, telecommunications networks. They purchased the productive capacity of a superpower for fractions of its value. By 1997, these men controlled assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, acquired during collapse for millions. They had converted crisis into ownership of irreplaceable physical infrastructure. The ethics were questionable. The strategy was historically sound. Asset number 4 requires understanding a different principle, the flight to external stability. In 1998, as the Russian ruble collapsed, ordinary citizens who held physical US dollars experienced something their neighbors did not: purchasing power preservation. While ruble-denominated savings lost 75% of their value in weeks, dollar holders could suddenly afford apartments, cars, years of expenses. The suitcase of Swiss francs phenomenon appears in nearly every currency crisis of the 20th century. Wealthy families in Weimar Germany held Swiss accounts. Argentine elites kept dollars in Miami banks. Venezuelan professionals hoarded euros in home safes. Foreign hard currency, physical cash from stable foreign economies, represents a portable, liquid store of value that survives domestic currency collapse. But this strategy has boundaries. In Cyprus, March 2013, the government faced a banking crisis and implemented something unprecedented in modern European history: a direct bail-in. Deposits over $100,000 were partially confiscated to recapitalize failing banks. Citizens who had trusted the banking system lost up to 47.5% of their uninsured deposits overnight. Capital controls followed immediately. ATM withdrawals were limited, wire transfers were blocked. Money that existed in digital form, even foreign currency deposits, became inaccessible. The lesson: foreign hard currency survives currency collapse, but only if held in physical form, outside domestic banking systems, accessible when borders close and controls tighten. Asset 5 is perhaps the most overlooked, yet it has saved more lives than gold and land combined. In post-World War II Germany, the formal economy had ceased functioning. The Reichsmark was worthless. The occupation authorities hadn't yet established a stable replacement. For 18 months, Germany operated on a barter economy, and the dominant currency was American cigarettes. A carton of Lucky Strikes could purchase furniture. A single cigarette could buy a meal. US soldiers discovered that their tobacco rations were worth more than their salaries. A private with access to the PX could live like a prince. Cigarettes succeeded as currency because they met specific criteria: portable, divisible, universally desired, relatively stable in supply. They were useful independent of their exchange value. This principle, holding scarce commodities with intrinsic utility, appears in every collapse. In the Soviet Union's final years, vodka became a unit of account. Workers were paid in bottles, services were priced in liters. The liquid was simultaneously product, currency, and store of value. In Venezuela today, as the bolivar approaches worthlessness, generators have become currency. Diesel fuel is hoarded like gold. Water purification systems trade for automobiles. Medicine commands prices that would seem absurd in stable economies. The pattern is consistent. When paper fails, utility prevails. Items that people need, genuinely need, for survival and comfort, become the foundation of exchange. Cigarettes, fuel, medicine, alcohol, ammunition, tools. These are not investments in the traditional sense. They are hedges against the complete failure of financial abstraction. Gold survives collapse. Land generates through it. Essential businesses operate despite it. Foreign currency preserves value during it. And physical commodities become currency when everything else fails. 5 assets, 1 pattern, but recognizing what survives is only half the equation. The other half is knowing when to act. Nearly a century of slow-motion disintegration. Each default slightly worse than the last. Each recovery slightly weaker. The greatest empire of the 16th century, controller of silver fleets, conqueror of continents, master of global trade, bled out over 4 generations, and at each stage the warning signs were visible to anyone who cared to look. This is the 7-stage pattern. It has repeated with mathematical consistency across 5 centuries of monetary history. Stage 1. Debt exceeds productive capacity. Spain's problem began with success. Silver flooded in from Peru and Mexico. More wealth than any European nation had ever possessed. But instead of building productive capacity, Spain spent. Wars in the Netherlands, wars in France, wars against the Ottomans. The silver didn't create Spanish industries. It purchased foreign goods and funded foreign armies. By 1550, Spain was borrowing against future silver shipments. Debt had begun growing faster than the economy that serviced it. Stage 2. Interest payments consumed the budget. By 1574, fully 40% of Spanish crown revenue went directly to interest payments on existing debt. Not to armies, not to administration, not to investment, to servicing previous borrowing. The Ottoman Empire reached this stage in the 1870s. Interest on foreign debt consumed 50% of imperial revenue. Britain reached it in 1947 when debt service exceeded defense spending for the first time in modern history. When interest payments dominate government budgets, the mathematics become inescapable. Stage 3. Money printing accelerates. Spain couldn't print paper currency in the modern sense. Instead, they debased coinage. The silver content of Spanish coins declined steadily through the 1600s. Copper replaced silver. The vellon coinage became increasingly worthless. The mechanism differs across centuries. The principle doesn't. When tax revenue cannot service debt, governments create new currency to fill the gap. Stage 4. Inflation becomes visible. Spanish prices quadrupled between 1500 and 1600. Bread, wine, cloth, labor. Everything cost more each decade. Citizens experienced this as a slow grinding erosion of purchasing power. They didn't understand monetary policy. They simply knew that life grew harder each year. This stage typically lasts decades. Citizens adapt. They complain. They assume it's temporary. They don't recognize it as systemic failure. Stage 5. The wealthy begin quiet exits. This stage is rarely documented in official histories, but it appears in private letters, in shipping records, in property transfers. Spanish nobles began converting assets to gold and moving wealth to Italian banks. Genoese bankers, Spain's primary creditors, began demanding payment in gold rather than silver. Smart money recognized the trajectory and positioned accordingly. In Britain during the 1960s, wealthy families quietly moved assets to Swiss accounts, Channel Island trusts, and foreign property. Capital flight preceded the official devaluations by years. This is the critical warning. When the wealthy begin protecting themselves, the timeline has accelerated. Stage 6. Capital controls imposed. Governments facing collapse do not accept defeat gracefully. They restrict movement of money, they impose currency controls. They close borders to capital flight. Spain banned gold exports in 1624. Britain imposed exchange controls in 1947 that lasted until 1979. The Ottoman Empire defaulted entirely in 1875 and surrendered fiscal control to foreign creditors. By stage 6, voluntary preparation becomes difficult. Legal channels close. The window for action narrows. Stage 7. Rapid collapse and currency death. The final stage happens faster than anyone expects. Spain's vellon currency lost 50% of its value in a single decree in 1641. The confidence that held the system together evaporates. What took decades to build collapses in months. The average timeline from stage 1 to stage 7 across all major currency collapses since 1500, approximately 50 years. But here is what matters. The timeline is not fixed. Some collapses take centuries, others take decades. The late stages compress rapidly. Spain took 90 years to move from stage 1 to stage 7. Weimar Germany took 9. The question responsible historians must ask, the question this documentary cannot avoid, is simple. What stage are we in now? There is a museum in Frankfurt that most tourists never visit. The Deutsche Bundesbank's Money Museum contains a collection that should disturb anyone who takes time to examine it. A graveyard of currencies, glass cases filled with beautifully printed notes, continental dollars, Confederate bills, Reichsmarks, pengő, dinars, bolivars, each one worthless, each one once trusted by millions. Each one now a historical curiosity, a cautionary artifact, a tombstone. Not a single paper currency in human history has survived, not one. The Roman denarius lasted 5 centuries before debasement destroyed it. The British pound sterling, the oldest currency, still in use, has lost 99.5% of its purchasing power since the Bank of England's founding in 1694. The US dollar has lost 97% of its value since the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913. Every empire believes it is different. Spanish kings believed their silver would flow forever. British ministers believed the pound would remain eternal. Soviet planners believed socialist economics would triumph where capitalism failed. They were all wrong. The pattern has never been broken. And here's what the mathematics tell us about the present moment. The United States federal debt now exceeds $34 trillion. Interest payments on that debt exceeded $1 trillion in 2023, more than the defense budget. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt service will consume 35% of federal revenue within 15 years. These are not projections from pessimists. These are official government estimates. The unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, federal pensions, exceed $200 trillion by some calculations. Not billions, trillions. Obligations that exist on paper, promised to citizens with no mathematical possibility of fulfillment at current dollar values. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve has created more dollars than existed in the prior century of American history. The money supply has expanded by levels that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Stage 1. Debt exceeding productive capacity. Confirmed. Stage 2. Interest payments consuming the budget. Confirmed. Stage 3. Money printing accelerating. Confirmed. Stage 4. Inflation becoming visible. Every citizen who purchases groceries can confirm this. Stage 5. The wealthy beginning. Quiet exits. Billionaire bunkers in New Zealand, family offices diversifying into gold and foreign property. Bitcoin adoption by hedge funds. The smart money is moving, quietly, steadily. Are we at stage 5? Stage 6? The historical record offers no comfort. No empire has ever reversed course at this stage. No government has voluntarily constrained itself once the debt spiral begins. The political incentives all point toward printing, toward inflation, toward the quiet theft of purchasing power from those who save in government currency. But the historical record also offers clarity. Gold has preserved wealth for 5,000 years. Productive land has survived every empire's collapse. Essential businesses continue operating when currencies fail. Hard foreign currency provides refuge when domestic money dies. Physical commodities become currency when financial abstractions become fiction. The families who survived 1923, Berlin, 1946, Budapest, 1991, Moscow, 2001, Buenos Aires, they didn't survive by accident. They recognized the pattern. They acted while action was still possible. They held assets that governments cannot print. Ilona walked into that Budapest bakery with 400 octillion pengő and bought one loaf of bread. Ferenc walked in with a single gold coin and fed his family for a month. Same economy, same collapse, same day, two completely different outcomes. The question this documentary leaves you with is not whether the pattern will repeat. The question is which line you're standing in.